In February 1890, a Union Pacific rotary snowplow hit a drift near Laramie, Wyoming, that measured 32 feet deep and 400 feet long. The engineer, a 28-year-old named Thomas Callahan, pushed the throttle to full and drove the spinning blade forward at 3 miles per hour. The rotary cut through frozen snow at 80 revolutions per minute. It took Callahan 11 hours to clear a single quarter-mile. Behind him, 200 men with shovels worked to widen the cut so a regular train could pass. Thomas Callahan was born in County Cork in 1861. His family came to New York in 1867 and drifted west with the rails. By 20, he was firing boilers out of Omaha. By 25, he had his engineer's papers. By 28, he was one of a handful of men in the United States Mountain Division who could run a rotary in a full blow without killing his crew. His wife, Margaret, lived in a rented room in Laramie with their 2 boys. She had not seen him for 6 weeks when he took the throttle on the Sherman Hill drift. I've been through the Union Pacific records on that storm, the dispatcher's log, the mechanical department notes, a handwritten letter Margaret Callahan sent to the company office. And what you find is that the snowplow story of American railroading is not really a story about machines. It's a story about men who climbed into an iron cab in the middle of a blizzard and were told to drive until the line was open or the boiler gave out, whichever came first. If the forgotten men of American railroading matter to you, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. This channel lives on the people who remember what winter used to cost. I'll keep finding these stories as long as you keep watching. 1 click, then stay with me. Because what Callahan and the men like him pulled off in the Rockies between 1869 and 1910 still doesn't quite make sense to me. And I've been reading the records for months. Here's the problem the railroads could not ignore. When Leland Stanford drove the Golden Spike at Promontory Summit in May 1869, the transcontinental line was open. Passengers could cross the continent in a week. Mail that used to take 6 months by ship now took days. And for about 4 months a year, depending on the winter, none of it worked. Because the Sierra Nevada gets 40 feet of snow in a bad year, the Wasatch gets 20. Sherman Hill on the Union Pacific sits at 8,247 feet and catches every wind off the plains. Drifts form in the cuts. Drifts form on the fills. Drifts form in the snow sheds when the sheds aren't long enough, which they usually weren't. A locomotive that could pull 40 loaded cars at sea level could not push 3 feet of wet snow up a 2% grade. The first solution was the wedge, a big iron triangle bolted to the front of a standard locomotive. You'd back up a mile, build speed, and ram the drift. If the snow was loose and dry, the wedge worked. If the snow was wet or packed or had a crust of ice on top, the wedge stopped dead and the locomotive stopped with it. Men climbed down with shovels. A 4-hour job became a 4-day job. A 4-day job became a week. And that was on a good line. On the Central Pacific west of Truckee, the Sierra snow was so heavy and so deep that wedges barely dented it. The company built 37 miles of snow sheds between 1867 and 1869. Wooden tunnels over the tracks, roofs pitched to shed slides. Inside the sheds, the trains ran day and night. Outside, the drifts kept coming, and the sheds kept catching fire from the sparks of the locomotives they were built to protect. You can see how desperate this was. A railroad company was spending a fortune to build wooden tunnels over its own tracks just to keep the snow off, hiring thousands of men to shovel by hand, stranding trains for days at a time with passengers eating hardtack and burning the seats for heat. There had to be another way. And for almost 20 years, nobody could find it. The answer came from a dentist. I'm not making this up. His name was J.W. Elliott, and in 1869, he drew a sketch of a locomotive with a giant spinning fan on the front. The fan would cut into the drift. Like the cut snow would be thrown out a chute on the side. He took the drawing to the railroads. They told him it would never work. He died without building one. But in 1884, a man named Orange Jull picked up Elliott's idea and improved it. Jull sold the design to the Leslie brothers of Paterson, New Jersey. Edward Leslie and his brother William took that sketch, put real iron and real steam behind it, and in the winter of 1886, the first working rotary snowplow rolled out onto the Canadian Pacific. It cut through a 12-foot drift at 3.5 miles an hour. The crews cheered, and the railroads of North America started writing purchase orders before the paint was dry. Let me explain how this machine worked, because the engineering is the part that makes me shake my head. The rotary snowplow was not a locomotive. One, it was a self-contained fighting unit pushed by one or more locomotives behind it. The front of the rotary was a wheel 10 to 11 feet in diameter. On that wheel were curved cutting blades, 8 to 12 of them, arranged like the petals of a steel flower. In the center, at the hub, was a set of hardened teeth designed to bite into packed snow or ice. Inside the rotary car sat a steam engine of its own, not for moving the plow forward. The locomotives behind did that. The rotary's engine existed for one purpose only, to spin that wheel. At full steam, the blade turned 80 revolutions a minute. The cutting edges sliced into the drift. Curved back plates caught the snow. Centrifugal force threw it up a chute, and out the top came a stream of white that could reach 200 feet sideways into the trees. That's what the photographs don't tell you. You look at a picture of a rotary at work, and you see a train in a snowdrift with some white spray coming off the front. What you don't see is the sound. Men who worked near these machines said the blade made a noise like a locomotive boiler coming apart. The whole rotary car shook. The crew braced themselves against the bulkheads. When the cut was clean, the blade hummed. When the blade hit a frozen log or a railroad tie buried in the drift, it screamed and sometimes tore itself apart. Because that was the problem nobody could solve. The rotary could cut snow. It could cut ice if the ice was clean. It could not cut a fence post, a dropped coupling pin, or a frozen cow. And in the Rockies and the Sierras, all three of those things ended up in drifts more often than you'd think. A fence buried by November reappeared as splinters in a rotary blade in January. The crew would feel the strike, hear the scream, kill the steam to the blade, and climb out with pry bars in 30 below weather to clean out the wreckage. A new rotary in 1890 cost around $40,000. That was a staggering sum. The railroads bought them anyway. By 1900, the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific, the Denver and Rio Grande, the Great Northern, and the Canadian Pacific each had a fleet of them stationed at strategic mountain depots. Cheyenne, Ogden, Truckee, Leadville, Glacier House in British Columbia. The rotaries sat on sidings through the summer, oiled and covered in canvas, waiting for the first big storm. When the storm came, everything changed. The superintendent would wire the division offices. Us crews would assemble at the roundhouse at 2 in the morning. Firemen would start the rotary's boilers. The locomotives that would push the rotary would couple up behind it, and a plow train would roll out into the dark, with a pilot engine ahead scouting the line and a caboose behind carrying 30 to 50 men with shovels and lanterns and cans of beans. I want to tell you about 2 of those crews. I pulled their names out of Union Pacific dispatcher logs from the winters of 1898 and 1904, cross-checked against the census and a couple of parish registers. These were not famous men. No book has their names, but they kept the country running in the months when nothing else did. The first crew was the Sherman Hill Fighting 9, working out of Laramie, Wyoming, in February of 1898. 9 men. Engineer Thomas Callahan, the same man I started with. Fireman Patrick Doyle, 23, from Dublin by way of Boston. Conductor Albert Pfeiffer, a German immigrant who had been a brakeman on the Baltimore and Ohio before coming west. 6 shovelers, 3 Irishmen, 2 Swedes, and a young man from Kansas named Clarence Webb, who was 19 and had lied about his age to get the job. On February 14, 1898, a storm dropped 5 feet of snow on the Sherman Hill grade in 8 hours. The wind drove the snow into the cuts at 60 miles per hour. The Fighting 9 left Laramie at midnight. They worked straight through to the evening of February 16th. 51 hours on the grade. They cleared 14 miles of track. The rotary's blade broke twice and was repaired by the shop crew who rode up from Cheyenne on a relief engine. Callahan slept 90 minutes in the engineer's chair. Clarence Webb, the 19-year-old, had lost 2 toes on his left foot to frostbite because his boots were wet and he would not stop shoveling to change them. Webb kept working for the Union Pacific for another 40 years. He died in Cheyenne in 1953. His obituary mentions the Sherman Hill Run as the proudest week of his life. The second crew was the Marias Pass Rotary crew of the Great Northern. working Montana in January of 1904. They had a harder time. Engineer Henry Gustafson, 34, born in Minnesota to Swedish parents. Fireman Louis LeBeau, a Métis man from the Red River country. Head shoveler Antonio Rossi, 41, an Italian immigrant with 6 children in a company house in Essex, Montana. On January 23, 1904, Marias Pass took a storm that dropped 7 feet of snow on the east portal in a single night. But the rotary cleared 4 miles before an avalanche came off the slope above the line and buried the plow train under 30 feet of hard slab. The pilot engine ahead was clear. The caboose behind was clear. The rotary and its pusher locomotive were gone. Gustafson was killed in the cab. LeBeau was killed at the firebox. Antonio Rossi was riding the rotary's auxiliary platform and went down with it. Dig crews worked for 9 days to pull the 3 bodies out. The Great Northern paid each widow $200 and waived the company store bill for the month. Antonio Rossi's widow moved the 6 children back to a cousin's farm near Chicago. The oldest boy, Giuseppe, started shoveling snow for the Chicago and Northwestern at age 14. He died in a railroad accident himself in 1919. Before I tell you what it was like to live on a snow fighting train through a full winter, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button. I mean it. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless people tell it we care. Tell it, 1 click, then come back. Because here's what almost nobody writes about. Snow fighting crews did not go home between storms, not in the mountains. The mountain divisions kept their rotary crews on site for the entire winter, 5 months at a stretch, living in boarding cars parked on sidings at Glacier, Stampede, Sherman, Truckee, and a dozen smaller passes. A boarding car was a converted boxcar, bunks stacked 3 high, a coal stove in the middle, a galley at one end where a cook worked from 4 in the morning. No women, no children, no mail except what the through trains dropped off. The men wore wool from the skin out, wool long johns, wool shirts, wool trousers, wool socks, wool coats, felt-lined boots, sheepskin gloves with canvas mitts over them. A good snow fighter could tell you the temperature within 5 degrees just by how the wool hung on his shoulders. When the wool got wet, you were in trouble. Wet wool does not dry on a boarding car in January. You hung it over the stove and hoped. Breakfast at 4:30, oatmeal, bacon when they had it, black coffee, beans for lunch, beans for dinner. A standing joke on the Great Northern was that a snow fighter could tell what month it was by the color of the beans. Pink in November, brown in February, black by April when the last of the sacks had been wet once and dried once and wet again. When the line was open, the crew slept. When the line closed, the crew worked. A bad storm could mean 40 hours in the cab or on the shovel line. Men hallucinated, men fell asleep standing up. A fireman on the Denver and Rio Grande in 1896 fell off the tender of a rotary and was not missed for 20 minutes. When they found him, he was still alive, curled up in the snow beside the tracks, but he lost both hands and his feet. The railroad sent him home to Pueblo. His wife ran a boarding house for the next 30 years, and he sat in the parlor and greeted the guests. The avalanches were the worst part. A rotary in a cut is a target. The blade noise loosens slab snow above. The heat plume from the locomotive changes the surface crust, and when the slope goes, nothing on earth will stop it. Between 1884 and 1910, railroad avalanches killed more men in the American mountain passes than any other single cause. I've counted 340 deaths in the records I can confirm. The real number is higher. A lot of men who went into the snow were never recovered until the spring melt, and some never were. The worst was Wellington, Washington, in March of 1910. 2 Great Northern trains, a passenger and a mail, had been stalled by snowslides for 6 days at the Wellington station on the west side of Stevens Pass. On the night of March 1st, a slab of snow a quarter-mile wide came off the slope above the depot and took both trains into the canyon. 96 people died. Most were passengers. Some were crew. The rotary that had been trying to clear the line ahead of them was itself buried, and its engineer, a man named J.J. Dougherty, was dug out alive after 14 hours. Dougherty quit the railroad after Wellington. He moved to Seattle. He would not talk about the accident to reporters. He died in 1934. The Great Northern renamed Wellington to Ty to try to kill the memory. It didn't work. People still go to that canyon with flowers in March, and yet the work went on, because the alternative was closed country. You cannot run a continent on rails that work 8 months a year. So every October, the rotaries came out of the sheds. The boarding cars got stocked. The men came back to Truckee and Sherman and Stampede and Marias. And when the snow came, they went out into it. I want to give you the numbers, because the numbers are part of the wonder. Between 1886 and 1920, American and Canadian railroads bought around 175 Leslie rotary snowplows. Each cost the modern equivalent of a small hotel. Each was tended by a crew of 30 to 60 men through the winter. Each cleared somewhere between 200 and 2,000 miles of track a season, depending on the storms. And behind each rotary, an army of shovelers widened the cut, dug out switches, cleaned frogs and guardrails, and kept the line running when the machine could not. The snow sheds stayed too. Central Pacific had 37 miles of them by 1870. By 1900, the Southern Pacific had over 40 miles on Donner Pass alone. Every summer, a crew rebuilt the sections that had burned or collapsed. Every winter, the sheds held back tons of snow that would have closed the line for months. If you drive over Donner today on Interstate 80, you are still passing the remnants of those sheds on the slope below you. Most people never notice. And the men who did the work, nobody remembers. Thomas Callahan finished his career as an engineer on the Union Pacific in 1922. He died in Laramie in 1939. His grave in Green Hill Cemetery has a plain stone with his name, his dates, and 2 words, Railroad Man. Margaret Callahan outlived him by 11 years and was buried beside him in 1950. Their 2 sons both worked for the Union Pacific. Neither ran a rotary. The rotaries by then were dying out. Diesel locomotives could push bigger wedges. Highway plows could clear the roads the railroads used to own. The snow sheds rotted where they stood. One more ask before I finish. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the real work, the real men, the machines nobody remembers, please subscribe. Subscribe to Global Old History. I'll keep finding these stories. You keep the channel alive by telling the algorithm we care. The last working Leslie rotary on a Class I American railroad ran on the Southern Pacific over Donner Pass in the winter of 1952. She was 62 years old. They took her out for a show run that February because the diesel rotaries could not handle a particular cut above Emigrant Gap. She cleared it in 4 hours. The crew that ran her had all started as boys on steam rotaries before the First World War. When they brought her back to Truckee, a photographer from the Sacramento paper was there. The picture shows 5 old men standing in front of a black iron machine, smiling. You can tell from their faces they know what they have just done. None of them were ever asked to run a rotary again. The machine went to a museum. The men went home. Most were dead within 10 years. The last of them, a retired fireman named Owen Halloran, he lived until 1978 and used to tell his grandchildren that he had worked on a train that ate snow. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. When you drive across the Rockies or the Sierras today on a winter afternoon, the highway is plowed. You don't think about it. The plow came by at 4 a.m. and nobody you know was involved. You drive over Donner Summit and you see the railroad line beside you, clear and black, and you don't wonder how it got that way. But someone cleared it. In 1890 and 1898 and 1904 and 1952, someone climbed into a cold iron cab at 2 in the morning and drove a spinning steel wheel into a wall of snow. Someone behind him shoveled for 40 hours without sleeping. Someone died in an avalanche in a canyon that nobody has marked. And the line was open in the morning. And the mail got through. And a boy in Kansas got a letter from his cousin in California, and neither of them ever knew the name of the man who made that possible. That was the railroad snowplow of America, 1869 to 1910 and a little beyond. Thomas Callahan and the Sherman Hill 9, Henry Gustafson and Louis LeBeau, under 30 feet of slab at Marias Pass. Clarence Webb with 2 toes gone, working 40 more years. J.J. Dougherty walking away from Wellington and never speaking of it again. Owen Halloran telling his grandchildren about a train that ate snow. Nobody stopped to write down his full name. Nobody put up a sign. The rotaries went to scrap or to museum lots. The snow sheds rotted. The boarding cars were broken up for kindling. But the lines are still there. The cuts are still cut. And on a cold morning in February, when the snow comes down the passes the way it came down in 1890, I think about the men in the cabs, and I think about the men with the shovels. And I take off my hat to them. I'm glad you stayed with me. If one of your own people ever worked a rotary or a shovel line or a mountain pass in winter, tell me in the comments. I read everyone. I'll see you in the next one.